Thetis returns to Achilles with new armor crafted by Hephaestus. Achilles lets loose his war cry, and the Achaean army gathers around him. Achilles promises to cease his rage against Agamemnon and rejoin the war. Agamemnon, in turn, blames the gods for his madness, as they blinded him and stole his wits. He pledges to Achilles all the treasures Odysseus promised him. Achilles accepts Agamemnon's non-apology and calls the Achaeans to war. Odysseus counsels to allow the men to eat and rest, and that Agamemnon do 3 things: give the gifts to Achilles now, swear he's never had sex with Briseis, and host Achilles at a feast. Agamemnon agrees, and Achilles begrudgingly agrees, but swears he will neither eat nor drink until he can wage war. He famously declares, "You talk of food. I have no taste for food. What I really crave is slaughter and blood and the choking groans of men." Just a wonderful line. The Achaeans follow the advice of Odysseus. Achilles refuses to eat, and Zeus sends Athena to place ambrosia deep within his chest to give him strength. With unbearable grief and bursting with rage, Achilles prepares to fight the Trojans. The narrative ends with one of Achilles' horses, roan Beauty, prophesying to Achilles about his death.
Welcome to Ascend Podcast, the Great Books Podcast. Ascend, thegreatbookspodcast.com. I'm Adam Minihan here with Deacon Garlick. Book 19. Before we jump into the book, though, as you just actually heard the synopsis of book 19 provided by our guide that you so diligently put together.
We're on question 85 of the question and answer guide.
Which is, I'm going to make it look cool, and you did all the hard work, and I'm just going to make it look cool. That's my plan.
That is your role in the podcast in general.
Just try to make it look, well, yeah, I mean.
Make things cool.
That's what I'm going to try to do.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see. Maybe I'll flop. I don't know. So I've talked about my sons and my older sons. You've talked about them, catching fish. By the way, one of them, did we talk about the massive fish that my son caught in your pond?
No. Go ahead.
Okay, well, that wasn't what I was going to talk about. But my son did catch a massive fish in your pond, about a month ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
But I also have a younger son who's 3 years old. He walks into our house and says, "I want a dangerous motorcycle." He's 3.
Mm-hmm.
He says that to his mom, my wife, which she immediately hated, right? Naturally. Now, he's pretty good. Just his balance, his coordination's pretty solid. He's 3 years old, riding a bike without training wheels or anything like that, no problems. Well, one of our neighbor kids has one of those little
dirt bikes.
Little dirt bikes, those mini dirt bikes, and so he sees that and he sees them go around. Well, they were outside. Dirt bike was running. Kickstand was on. He sees it.
Uh-oh.
And darts outside he's on fire. He's running straight towards it. Gets on it, kicks the kickstand, goes like this, and jets down the sidewalk. There's cars right there in the driveway. He snakes around these cars, which we thought he was for sure going to hit.
So you're watching him at this point?
Yeah, and we're screaming at him to come back. He's
right.
snaking through these cars, turns around because he hears us yelling to come back. Zooms right there and then slams on the brakes and does this skid, the coolest 3-year-old skid I think I've ever mentioned.
Friends see him?
Oh yeah, everybody was there.
Whole neighborhood.
And my wife just was could not believe what just happened. 1, that he's still okay. 2, that he didn't hit a car. And he got off and he obviously was about to get into trouble because we already mentioned, do not get on these, but whatever you do not get on these dirt bikes. I think he realized though, I'm going to get in trouble, but it's going to be worth it.
This is going to be awesome.
Yeah.
I should say for the veracity of the story that your son has had the most freakish sense of balance as a child I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Like even like as soon as that kid could walk, his balance on like scooters, bicycles,
Yeah.
etc. is freakish.
Yeah, but it's like really cool. Okay, he can ride a bicycle without training wheels or anything like that. But he's still 3. Right? So it's the same thing as like, okay, there's an 11-year-old that can drive a car.
So I guess like on the motorcycle, because there's nothing about how tall you are. So as long as you can get on it
And go.
it's the handles,
Right.
right? Oh, okay.
So it's like, an 11-year-old who can drive a car is great, but they're 11,
Right.
So their maturity, their mental capacity isn't, there yet.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing with a 3-year-old who can ride a bike or a dirt bike. Yeah, he can maybe do it, but he's not looking around. He's not like observing any laws. He's not like looking out for cars or people.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was a fun moment as a dad. I knew he had to get in trouble. I knew. I mean, this is like the rule was set.
Were you like trying not to smile and be proud of him?
Yeah, I was trying not. The rule was set. He broke the rule in the Minihan house.
Right.
This yields to discipline. But I was also pretty proud.
It's good. We haven't had any moments like that in the Garlick household. What's been going on at our house? I'm still trying to get our ducks. So we built a duck house. I think I mentioned that.
Yeah.
And now we have. We haven't even got our ducks and geese trained, and my wife went off and bought more. So now we got 2 more pilgrim geese.
Hedging her bets, huh? She's just
Yeah, well, one of them's a little gimpy,
Mm-hmm.
so
Not
not entirely
make it.
sure what happened. If like a coyote comes or something, it's going to be rough because she just can't really walk well, right? I mean, she makes it, but she just can't walk very well. So we bought these 2 little other pilgrim geese. So we have 4 pilgrim geese. We have 7 khaki Campbell ducks, and so we habituated them to the duck house, and then recently last weekend we took the fence away. And so, because we thought they had been,
and they all flew away.
well, no, they're still here.
And that was the last time we saw them.
Our buddy Dr. Malash had that happen. He let his ducks out, and then they all just
They all flew away.
So being horrified of that story, I really tried to find ducks that I was told do not fly away. Right. These are egg-laying ducks, and they kind of stay there along with the geese. And so, however, I thought you would enjoy their night because my wife greatly enjoyed that. One night they decided not to go up. So just like chickens and stuff. Like as soon as it gets right to be dusk, like it's the easy time.
Yeah.
Like they naturally want to go somewhere safe.
Right.
Well, the ducks decided that this little island in the middle of our pond was safe, and it's not really safe because the water there is anywhere from like 4 inches to 6 inches deep. Because it's not really the pond; it's like the overflow from the other pond. But they like staying there because it's shallow, and that's where all the little minnows are and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So they all get on this island, and I hear my wife outside like trying to call to them and be like, "Hey, she literally has like a duck song that she sings, and they're supposed to like come," which usually works. It was not working, and so it had been a long day, and I was tired, and I did not want to spend the next 45 minutes trying to coax these ducks. So I figured the best thing to do was to teach them that area is not safe. So I just grabbed a broom and just went walking out into the pond, right? Because I can't reach the island.
Right.
Just went stomping out in the pond, which I think really surprised them. They were not expecting that,
Right.
And then of course they go freaking out, and then they finally kind of went up, and it was actually very effective. It's not something I actually would like to do every evening, but it was highly effective. And then everyone was like serious, and like it worked, and like the ducks went up, and then like an hour later, my wife was like, "That was really funny to watch you like go."
I
in the
would
pond."
like to
I was
see
like,
that,
"Babe,
yeah.
I'm trying. I did not want to sit there for forever." And like, "Here, ducks. Like, here's some peas. Here's some like corn.
Let me
like,
sing you a melody.
Right. Like the duck house automatic door had already shut. Like we are
Yeah.
past evening. We're in nighttime.
Right.
And I'm out here, in my
Stupid
pond.
ducks.
So anyway, I'm very excited to talk about the Iliad and not about my ducks that are not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Well, so book 18, we just finished book 18. One of my favorite books thus far. Actually, probably my favorite book thus far.
18 was?
18, yes. Rolling into 19, we had Achilles finally got his armor, and so he's very much ready for battle at this point.
Right. Okay, so just like kind of tracking the basic narrative, and I think getting to a few themes that we see pop up. So Achilles gets his armor, right? So this is kind of the main thing, right? So we get all the armor. We see he's concerned about Patroclus's body, right? So Thetis then promises, oh, we'll watch over the body, like,
Right.
but you need to renounce your rage, etc. So I think really kind of the crux, opening here is we get this kind of meeting between Achilles and Agamemnon. And this is like the resolution that we've been waiting for since book 1. Right, so they got wrapped around the axle about Briseis, and really it's probably more about his honor and his glory. And so here we finally get Achilles and Agamemnon coming together. And it's really kind of fascinating, I think, to push into this a bit and ask ourselves, like, what is actually happening?
Yeah, because this is a moment, we've been waiting for this moment for like 400 pages.
Yeah, we have.
So-
We have countless lines of poetry, and we have arrived, right? So I think that, Achilles kind of repeats the same line that he already did, right? So he's like, was this really good? Did this really work? No, it didn't, right? For years to come, I think they'll remember the feud that flared between us both. Enough, let bygones be bygones, like done is done. I call a halt to all my anger. So I guess like because a first time reader, I guess my question here to you is like, to what degree do you think like Achilles has actually resolved his anger, like his rage? Like, so if we talk about, we're singing with the muses, the rage of Achilles, now we get his, I guess we can call it an apology, maybe just kind of a ceasefire. Like, what do you think about the rage of Achilles? Like, is it actually placated? Like, where's it gone?
No, I think it's just been oriented to something more important in his level of hierarchy of like what is important to him. Now, he has kept this hatred for Agamemnon for, like we said, 400 pages, right? And so in order to get him off center, so to speak, of his hatred for King Agamemnon, something else had to come up that was going to push him over the top. It seems like, obviously the book is about the rage of Achilles, as
Right.
the opening book talks about. So it's not like that his rage is just going to cease to exist. It may be tempered. It may be higher, low peaks. It may have peaks and valleys. But to me, this was more of this is a little bit petty. Like, for me to still be upset with you, my main focus right now is to revenge Patroclus. I know that was at least my first take, my raw take.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of insight there, because he, in this passage, he says, I call a halt to all my anger, I swear off my rage, etc. And what we see really, it doesn't last very long, because we even see in book 19, and we'll kind of maybe flag them as we kind of work through it. There are a lot of areas in which his rage is still very clearly going, right?
Yeah,
it's simmering right underneath the surface, and I think that you've really nailed it. That really what we probably should view this as is that his rage is simply transferred. So it's not like a real resolution with Agamemnon. It's not like there's no repentance on either side, right?
Right.
It's just on Achilles' side, it's more just like, hey, this isn't working, I'm done. But really it's because he's still very angry, but that's all been transferred to Hector, right?
I also thought, I'm curious on your thoughts here, because like you read, he says, and this is around 72, line 72 or so, he says, for years to come, I think they will remember the feud that flared between us both. Right, so I see pride here a lot in Achilles, because he has already made the decision that he's not going to go back home and live a long life, but that he will, he'll be here in Troy, and his name will be, he'll have a legacy, and his name will be talked about for years to come. It almost seems like right here he's talking about, like, listen, I have to put this aside right now, because my pride, because I don't want everybody to be talking for years to come about our stupid fight between us. I want to be known for something more.
Yeah, and in certain ways, I think there's some truth to that. I think also he has to kind of, it would seem he has to kind of redirect things a little bit, because remember, he promised, we're kind of allowing some of his promises to kind of just slip away, right? Like he would not fight until they were burning the ships right up to his ships.
Right. Yeah.
And so now he's like, well, hey, by the way, this is dumb. Like, let's just stop. It's not working for anyone.
Right.
Which, if you remember, like when he sent Patroclus out, by that point, he's even realizing this isn't working.
Right.
But his pride at that point, is kind of a dance between his rage and his pride. His pride at that point is saying, like, well, I can't give in now. Right. So here, he seems very much that the rage now that's transferred towards Hector allows him to basically, I would very much hesitate to call it humility, but just allows him to say, hey, we're moving on.
Yeah, it allows him to pivot his rage to something else.
Which, I have to say, Achilles' apology is better than Agamemnon's.
Agamemnon's like half apology like really upset me. In fact, like it was like I wrote in the book like what poor leadership. This is like just goes back to, as a leader, listen, if you make a mistake, you have to own up to it. Like have some humility. Say like, that's what's actually going to make people want to follow you more is like if you show a little bit of like humility. Mm-hmm. But instead, what does he do? He says, he says that he's not to blame. That Father Zeus, fate and the fury stalking through the night, made him do it, made him do all these things. And that he's like, what could I do? Like he almost acted like he has no free will. Like this is just what they told me like was going to happen. And so I had no choice whatsoever. I thought it was just so weak.
Yeah, it's more of a fatalistic non-apology, I think, than anything else. He just blames the gods. And he blames a very particular god too, right? Ruin, which is capitalized, right? Mm-hmm. Ruin, the eldest daughter of Zeus. She blinds us all, that fatal madness. And then he kind of makes the argument like, hey, look, even Zeus was blinded by her one time, right? Then we kind of get this mythology about Ruin. As a side note, Ruin caught my attention because... And we'll get there eventually on Ascend, the Great Books podcast. But when we get to Plato, Ruin is talked about. So Ruin is A-T. So it's spelled 8, right? Like that's her name. It's A-T-E. So it's pronounced like A-T, right? Like they're both long vowels. And so she's actually talked about in Plato's Symposium. So in Plato's Symposium, when Agathon, the tragic poet, he's praising Eros, the god Eros. When he's doing that, he actually... compares Eros to to Ruin. Because they have this kind of fascinating kind of little line where it talks about their tender feet, right? Kind of walking on the souls of men. And he actually quotes this line from Homer directly. And he makes these like kind of comparisons there because Eros is this, Eros is this, it's a madness, but it's a madness that draws you into the divine, right, into beauty, just kind of broadly speaking, right? It has this ecstasy about it.
It's almost like Eros.
Right, that's what, so like there's this, so, right, so Eros has this like quality to it, right? And Ruin is kind of like that, but she just is a madness. There's not the beauty aspect. So in certain ways you could see her maybe as a foreshadowing, right, of the erotic of Eros. Mm-hmm. Hesiod, like we've talked about Hesiod a few times. I think we're actually probably going to read Hesiod right after we get done with Homer, right? Just he has a short theogony about where all the gods came from. He talks about Eros. Eros is one of the like original primordial gods. We don't get Eros in Homer, but we have this we have this Ruin. Mm-hmm. So there's a few kind of connections, and she pops up a little bit in mythology. She doesn't really play a huge role, but there is this kind of like question about the madness that she brings. Mm-hmm. And I think it's notable too that a lot of times, even though she's not immediately connected to like the erotic or to beauty, I noticed that when she is mentioned, right, one, she's female, it's a goddess, and two, it does tend to pivot on the feminine at times, right? So Hera does these things to Zeus, right? Agamemnon and Achilles get wrapped around the axle about Briseis, right? A woman, at least as a proxy, right? You also see earlier we saw love conquer Zeus. Remember when sleep and love conquer Zeus? Mm-hmm. So it kind of starts hinting a little bit. Homer doesn't really talk about the primordial gods much. It's just the Olympian gods. He doesn't really have this mythology of like these primordial gods that are kind of behind them, right? Like things like love. And so AT kind of gives us this, insight a little bit. So just as like a little mythology, that's on a side. But all that to say, really interesting mythology, terrible apology.
Terrible apology. And then, so Achilles is like he transitions. He wants to go to he's talking about like he wants to go to war. Like obviously, I don't want to deal with you anymore, Agamemnon. Like let's focus on this war. And I thought it was really weird around like 180, 179. Not weird, but it just goes to show you like how I think it gives a little insight into what like who Achilles really is, or maybe even what the the readers of the time or the people who are listening to this story like. We talked about like Achilles being the guy who everybody looked up to for, in some capacity because
he's like the assumed protagonist.
Right. Yeah. Because he was really good at war.
Right.
Right. And so he says like he talks about how, but now quickly call up the wild joy of war at once. It's like the wild joy.
It's a wonderful line.
I thought that was really interesting because, I think most guys, we've talked about this before on the podcast, right? It's the human aspect of people going into war. You have this image that they're going to have this fortitude and like get in there and like yell and scream and bang around the shields and all this stuff. But that's not really what happens. Is a lot of times they're scared, they're worried, they want to run, they try to make peace, they try to talk about their grandfathers so that way they can
they come out and give long monologues about Bellerophon.
But here Achilles is talking about no, this is the wild, like this is what he's like almost like desiring. This is like what is like he's calling upon the wild joy of war. I thought that was really interesting.
No, it's a wonderful phrase. It's actually one I underlined and put like little quotations around it because I didn't. It was a phrase that really captures the imagination.
Right.
And then Odysseus, right, has to come in and temper this, right? Like, hey, by the way, I know you want to go fight, but like the men haven't eaten, right? We've got to do these things. And then Odysseus, like, I think, kind of being if Nestor is the kind of quintessential old age equals wisdom, I'm from, the age when men were better kind of, analog figure, then, Odysseus is kind of the cleverness, right? And I think that's what we're seeing here because he kind of intercedes right now and says, hey, the men are hungry. He gives these three things that we have to have, right? So he's like, hey, why don't you give Achilles all the gifts, right? By the way, you also need the promise, right, that you haven't slept with Briseis, and then you need to actually treat Achilles to like a feast. It's interesting because what is this actually aimed at? And I think at least like on the surface you could say like, hey, I think is this aimed at true reconciliation, right, between Agamemnon and Achilles, right? Because I think Odysseus is seeing that the whole crux of the Achaean victory over Troy, at least in large part, is predicated upon Achilles and Agamemnon actually getting along. Now we actually have this quote-unquote apology, but you don't have to scratch the surface much to realize that there's nothing to this, right? This is just very weak and shallow, right? Achilles his anger is still there. It just happens to be distracted at the moment, right? As a new target. And Agamemnon very much gives a non-apology. So I read this very much as like, what is Odysseus trying to do right here? And I think at one you could say it's a true reconciliation. That might be too thick of a read because you could question whether or not you can have true reconciliation with characters like Achilles and Agamemnon, right? I think at least it's a practical binding, right? Like, hey, we kind of have a moment in which we're all getting along. Like, to what degree can I actually try and shore this up, right? So, okay, well, why don't we give all the gifts now? So you see this is actually going to happen while we've all agreed. We agreed about Briseis. Like, let's give the gifts right now. Like, yes, the men need to eat. Make this promise about Briseis, by the way. Let's just get that out of the way, right? And then also, why don't we feast, right? So there's this, like, fraternity. So I think that Odysseus here is really trying to kind of strengthen these bonds, and at least on a practical level, so the Achaean army holds together.
Yeah, that's actually how I read it. When I read it, I thought, like, oh, he's doing all of this for he's an opportunist. Like Odysseus, every time it seems like he's an opportunist. So I read this as he's doing this for optics purposes. He's like, listen, you both are like in a stage that we haven't seen yet. We need the morale. If we're gonna go fight, we need the morale to be up with our armies. So why don't you outwardly show like that you guys have come to an agreement, and like let's eat because the morale's gonna be up. We're all gonna be ready for battle before we actually go in. And so that I just looked at it as Odysseus capitalizing on an opportunity and for it to be an optics opportunity, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think there's something. I think at minimum he's trying to forge a certain amount of like practical bonds between the men to hold this army together. Well, because if these two fall apart, then we're right back where we were.
Right, and remember the army's been sitting here fighting for 10 years, watching Achilles just sitting over there by the ships. And if they all of a sudden see it in this feast, oh, Achilles has new armor. Oh, Achilles is here actually now feasting with us. Oh, Achilles has made peace with Agamemnon. Well, what's that going to do to the art? What's that going to do to the troops?
Right. So I think that So we see Achilles, and this kind of leads us then into this kind of famous line that we said kind of in the opening narrative. But, because they're urging to the feast, to the banquet, so around like 255 or so, you get this like, famous line of like, you talk of food, I have no taste for food. What I really crave is the slaughter and blood and choking groans of men, right? So outside of like, you kind of see why, like it's interesting in Plato's Republic, one of the reasons he critiques Homer is that all the young Greek men want to be like Achilles, right? You see like this adolescent appeal in a lot of his things, right? He can say whatever he wants to because he could defeat anyone on the battlefield. Like it's kind of just a raw power, like he's the main guy,
Right.
But I think pushing a little deeper here, one of the things that we've been tracking, and I like this perception, is simply that what we're seeing, it started in book 18 in a lot of ways, and what we're seeing in book 19 is a certain trajectory of Achilles. There's a certain deification that's happening to him. He's becoming more godlike. And we see these phrases a lot. Like, he's already talked about godlike Achilles, but there's going to be a lot of little phrases about him, like, raging like a god, fighting like a god, like a frenzied god. Like, so one way to look at what's happening in 18 and 19 and moving forward is he's kind of on this upward arc of becoming more godlike. And it's kind of being driven by his rage, right? So because in the Homeric, right, presentation, to become, to give into that rage, to be able to just basically destroy everyone around you, right, to be able to satiate that anger is actually very divine, right? Because we see this in the Olympian gods. And I think one way you can kind of start to see it in small ways is simply that the guy doesn't eat.
Right.
It's actually going to be several chapters before he decides to actually eat.
Yeah.
And so not only then do we see him not eating, which I think is part of that, he has an inhuman rage. He starts to give up human appetites, right, if you will. It's not even terribly clear in this passage that he even cared about Briseis. Right, he kind of just calls a truce, right, and says, "Hey, okay, I'm okay with you, Agamemnon. Let's go fight the Trojans." Right, that's what he wants to do.
Right,
and it's kind of like Odysseus is like, "Oh, there's gifts and Briseis. Remember her?
Yeah.
Like, hey, like,
that's a good point.
Right, he's not focused on that.
No.
And so there's a certain thing that like his human appetites are being tampered down, and he has this kind of divine, inhuman rage that's kicking in. So like he won't eat.
That's interesting.
Right.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So they give the gifts. They do the lavish feast. You even see at like right after the like choking groans of men passage, right? Odysseus trying to calm him. I mean, that rage is simmering. It's still very much present, and you can kind of see Odysseus trying to hold things together
yeah.
Right? So they. Let's see. They bring out Briseis. Agamemnon does. He actually goes a little further and says that he never laid a hand, on the girl, right? And I never forced her to serve my lust in bed or perform some other task, right?
Yeah,
so he actually, it's a little bit further than.
That's a weird thing.
Well, he just, he makes his promise, so that's good, right?
It's like, too much information. We didn't actually have to add that secondary part,
right?
Like
Briseis remained untouched in my tents, right?
Yeah,
true, blah blah blah.
That's good enough.
Right. So they
perform some other tasks. Like,
yeah, we don't have to like overly dwell on it.
Fair enough.
So we don't have to like parse that out, I think.
Okay, good.
So, but anyway, the important part is right. He goes ahead and makes that oath, right? That he didn't. So then they have the sacrifice. So then we get this really fascinating passage that I want to talk about, which is Briseis, which is like Aphrodite. So this is like 335.
Yeah.
So. She then, right, it's not clear, right, she goes and she sees Patroclus for the first time.
Yeah.
Right? And she has this like really strong reaction to it.
Yeah. What were your thoughts on that?
I had a lot of thoughts. So let me read a little bit of this, and then maybe I might turn to the guide just to make sure my thoughts are kind of controlled on this, because I think there's an insight here that I find fascinating.
Okay.
So she goes by and she immediately starts wailing about Patroclus. And it's not entirely, I mean, maybe if there's a more attentive reader out there, but like for me, it wasn't immediately apparent why Briseis, the slave girl whose whole family was slaughtered by Achilles, is going to be crying weeping at the death of Patroclus, right? Like what? There's a connection here that I don't think has been made in Homer yet, right? Between these two characters, clearly we know they're associated with one another because they were both in Achilles' tent, etc. But like, we haven't seen like a connection between these two. So really, that's what caught my attention. Is like, why is she crying? Why is she doing all this? So a little bit before 350, right? She's like, oh, but you, Patroclus, would not let me weep, not when swift Achilles cut down my husband, right? He plundered my city, blah, 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 blah. And then she says, no, again and again you vowed you'd make me like godlike Achilles' lawful wedded wife. You would sail me west in your warships, going home, and there with the Myrmidons hold my marriage feast. So now I mourn your death, I will never stop. You were always kind. And I found this fascinating, so let me turn to the guide real fast just to make sure I don't miss anything, because I really thought about this. So... so there's two primary reasons that I think we need to focus on here.
Okay, what's number one?
Is first, I think you could tether this insight into Patroclus's mission in Troy to help Achilles quell his anger. So in other words, Patroclus sees marriage as a way to help his friend temper his emotions and mature. So I think that's one thing to think about is that, so there's two things happening here, right? Is that Patroclus's mission that we saw was that his job was to help Achilles handle his anger. He did not do a great job, but that was his mission, right? That's what we learned when Nestor was retelling a story about going and trying to get them into the war.
Correct.
So it's fascinating to me here that then Patroclus is the one trying on the side to tell Briseis, like, hey, you're going to get to marry Achilles. And whether or not we can tether these two together, that Patroclus sees Achilles' marriage to Briseis as a way to humanize him, right? As a way to kind of temper his emotions, to actually temper his rage, right? And so I think that's fascinating. And the reason this kind of leads into the second point is that this leads into Thetis presenting Achilles with his two fates, to return to Troy, marry, and live a long life, or fight and die in Troy to gain immortal glory. So the question becomes whether in Achilles' mind, returning home meant marrying Briseis. So that's what this starts to bring together, and that's what I think is so fascinating, is does Achilles know, right? So she's talking with Patroclus that, like, you told me this would happen. Mm-hmm. One of the questions is, does Achilles know that this promise has been made? Does he know that Patroclus was saying this to, Briseis, right? And so, because the reason is, like, the question then is whether this revelation about her marrying him informs, in part, his rage against Agamemnon for taking her. Does that make sense? So instead of it just being, you stole the slave girl from my tent, what's actually been percolating behind the scenes is that Achilles realizes that is my potential bride that you've taken, right? Not just like my slave girl, but actually, my potential bride.
Whose husband I've already killed.
Yeah, there's a weird component to this. But and what that means is that Thetis' kind of promise for him of going home and marrying and living this life becomes far less speculative and much more concrete. Like, so when he's thinking about, do I go home and marry and have a family, or do I stay here in Troy? Like, one of the questions becomes, is that this isn't just a speculative, like, I'll go home and find a wife. Is he thinking about Briseis, right? Is he thinking, like, about my future life with Briseis? I think he is. And so, one kind of wonders then whether her returning to his tent will make him rethink his decision, or whether his rage over the death of Patroclus will continue to outweigh all else, right? So there's something about, like, are we going to see another decision that has to be made now that she's actually back, right? That she has that proximity to him. Finally, I think we have to note the irony that Homer presents Patroclus, the one who had the mission of tempering Achilles' rage, now serving as a source of that rage, a rage that's blinding him to his potential life with Briseis, right? So, I mean, it's stacking on top of one another. So it really, I think, gave a little bit of thickness to, and Homer leaves some of this, for us to simply, just kind of imaginatively consider. But the idea that Patroclus and Briseis are tethered together and that Patroclus made certain promises to her, I think plays into the mission, and then really just opens up some speculative questions about what Achilles saw his life as, both in his relationship to Briseis and him choosing the fate of not going back home and having a family.
Yeah, I think I saw Achilles seeing like when he made that decision that he's not going to go back and have a family, that he sees it as. Once I read this chapter, because this kind of reveals a lot, right? I didn't know this up until this chapter, but I thought, oh well, that's why he doesn't want to go back. It's very clear that he has already chosen he doesn't want to go back to have a family, and it's also very clear that he doesn't have this strong desire for Briseis. Like it's very clear he doesn't care about her as a person very much.
One thing I kind of noted here too is there a comparison now between Briseis and the eventual fate of Andromache? Right, because what is she saying here? Like, oh, you killed, you killed my husband, you killed my whole family, right? You raided my city, and it's really interesting that like this. There's some parallels here to then what we anticipate to be the fate of Andromache. Not that I think she's gonna, marry Achilles, but I think that you're seeing a woman, right, in a state that we anticipate Andromache being in, right? That she too is going to become a slave to one of the Achaean warlords, and then what does that mean for her? So I think there's some parallels that run there.
I agree.
So, okay, so moving forward, let's see here. Oh, Prince Neo. Little Prince Neo. So apparently Achilles has a son, so that gets dropped in book 19. Achilles has a son, and so we don't know much about him.
If you, the listener, have taken a deep dive on him, I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, this is the first time, right, in the Iliad that we're kind of made aware. Little Prince Neo does end up having a role in the Trojan War. That's kind of the post-Iliad kind of mythology and legend. But it's worth noting, right? So that's 389 that he pops up. So let's see here. Okay, so let's jump back to our Achilles is becoming a god.
Okay.
And I think that if you look at like 4:15 or so, I think part of this theory gets a strong justification when that he's actually fed on sweet ambrosia deep in his chest, right? So he's actually fed, the gods feed him, Athena feeds him directly with the nourishment of the gods, right? So again, are his human appetites waning, and his appetites are reordering towards the divine, and he has a somewhat divine rage that is kicking in. So then the passage ends with
him gearing up for battle.
Well, yeah, and his horses. So how did you? So you're a first-time reader, like.
Oh yeah, where is that?
480.
480.
So what did you think when you were? This is kind of how the book ends. What did you think about just, all of a sudden Achilles is gearing up for war finally, and his horse decides to prophesy about his death? Just typical anticipation, right? Like
you're still doomed to die. Just letting you know, as he's like, I can just imagine him like putting on his shield and like whatever the forearm guards are. What are those called? Do you know forearm guards?
Forearm guards is definitely
that?
what they're called.
Yeah, forearm and shin guards. Shin guards. I like it. He's putting all this stuff on, and he's like mentally preparing, and his stupid horse, just comes out and says, "By the way, you're still doomed to die."
Yeah, I think that. I mean, one of the questions is like, what is the actual purpose of this scene? Because he doesn't seem to be given anything he doesn't already know, right? You are still doomed to die by force, Achilles, cut down by a deathless god and mortal man. So, some of the questions I have is, Hera is the one that gives him the voice. So Hera's for the Achaeans. So why does Hera feel like this needs to be said, or like why does she think that Achilles needs to be prodded in this way, right? That's an open question. I'm not sure I have like a great answer to that. And then probably more telling, assuming I'm not reading too much into it, is that then the Furies, not to be pronounced as furries, which would highly change the meaning of that passage, right? I have to be really careful when I type that in the guide that I don't make that mistake. So the Furies strike the horse dumb, right? They make him mute.
Yeah.
And the Fury, I think we've talked about the Furies before, but the Furies in Greek mythology They're the avengers, right? They're the ones that, like, when someone commits an injustice, right? So imagine, like, we've talked about the guest friendship of hospitality, right? So, like, if you're a guest and you strike out against your host, or your host strikes out against you, and you have, broken these sacred bonds that Zeus cares for, right, between the guest and the host. Like the Furies would be the one that might hunt you down, right? Or you sin against your father, right? The Furies might be the ones that hunt you down and kind of pay out your injustice.
Make justice,
So it's interesting to me to line up that mythology with that the Furies intercede and strike the horse dumb, which then tends to communicate to me that this was an act of injustice, right?
Well, it seems like it's a salt in the wounds kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And then Achilles like bursts out in anger, and he says, like, why do you have to prophesy my doom? Don't waste your breath. I already know this. Like, I know this is to be true. So to me, it just seemed like it was kind of a salt in the wound. Like, by the way, just letting you know, you're going to die. You know?
And it doesn't help, too, that they say, hey, we're not to blame, right? Basically, because he made this little comment about, you left Patroclus on the field dead, right? And then they kind of make this thing of like, well, we're not to blame for that. So we're both now bringing in Patroclus' death, which is going to cause some consternation amongst Achilles, and then we are also then reminding Achilles that he is going to die. And so it just seems, salt in the wound's a good way to do it. There's just this unnecessary provoking of Achilles' wrath.
Interesting chapter, interesting book. I first time reader, I knew something had to happen for Achilles and Agamemnon to come to peace before he goes out into battle. I had like this high hope, or maybe a optimism that Agamemnon would have been a better man in the process. I think Odysseus plays his role very well in the whole process. He's the cool tactician. He sees the opportunities. I actually think opportunist is actually a better word for him. I think he just takes. It just seems like he sees opportunities and he takes advantage of it.
We should keep in mind that Agamemnon did sacrifice his daughter.
Right,
So
I know. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's like
bar of expectations.
I had this optimism for him. Like I thought, like, well, maybe he will come back. Like,
Right.
But
very good. We are moving right along in the Iliad, and so I think next week, as we kind of track the entrance into book 20 and also into 21, I think one theme that we can watch is, do we see evidence of this deification of Achilles? Do we see that this rage is pushing him into kind of these divine attributes, while also to somewhat, evidence this thought? We also see his human appetites being somewhat suppressed, right? So I think it's a theme that we can watch over the next couple books.
Cool. Well, as you guys are going through it as well, if you guys are in a small group or something like that, send us a picture. Let us know like how it's going. Let us know what you think of the guide. You can go find our guide your guide, our guide. Yeah,
our guide. You make things cool.
Yeah, our guide on the website. But reach out to us on social media. We'd love to hear and see how things are going. If there's anything that we can do to maybe help. If you guys have questions, we'd love to enter into a dialogue and see what your guys' thoughts are. Yeah. So, all right. Well, we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.